this, I'm never talking about this show ever again.
Jerry Springer!
I don't think anybody knew how crazy this show was going to be.
I'd like to take this opportunity to apologize for everything I've ever done. I have ruined the culture.
At the beginning of 1992, Jerry Springer was coming to Chicago to launch a talk show.
We were this little band of crazy people just trying to survive the week.
All I had to do was convince him, let's make it wild.
Variety show and a weekly magazine compare the fights to pro wrestling.
Teeth were knocked out.
It really was the modern version of the Roman Coliseum.
Springer's the first talk show host ever to knock Oprah Winfrey off her throne as the queen of daytime talk.
He became a cultural icon.
I want the show to demonstrate outrageousness, yes.
The bigger that show got, it raised questions about what really went on backstage.
The producers were coaching us on what to say and how to act. They weren't interested in what kind of impact it was going to have on you.
From the historic and haunted heartland of Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all, young and old, to this special episode of the world-famous Necronomicast. Episode 290 is upon us, my friends, and this episode happens to feature the creative team of Sophie Jones and Luke Sewell. They're the creative force behind a new jaw-dropping premium two-part series on Netflix that tells the story of the Jerry Springer Show as it's never been told before. This Netflix documentary explores how this daytime talk show became one of the biggest and most outrageous TV shows of the 90s. An entertaining facade, darker truths, a murkier picture begins to emerge. So join me and my guests all about fights, camera, action. And now calling in on the International Newsmaker Hotline for the Necronomicast, I'm so excited to be joined by the filmmaking team of Sophie Jones, the executive producer, and Luke Sewell, the director of Jerry Springer, Fights, Camera, Action, all the way from London. How are you guys?
Very well, thank you, Brian. How are you?
Fantastic. Sophie, nice to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Thanks for having us.
I am super excited that we were able to put this together. I have a long time fascination and love with Jerry Springer. And like even going back as a kid, watching like the old Morton Downey Jr. show. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Morton Downey Jr. show, kind of a precursor to Jerry Springer, but I was in college during the heyday of Jerry Springer. And so it was must-see television. So this documentary really brought back a lot of crazy memories and really hit home in a lot of ways for me.
Amazing. That's what we like to hear. Incredible.
It's a good dose of nostalgia, isn't it?
It is. Like TV was like, I don't want to say like an more innocent time, but it sure seemed like watching some of these things that were so shocking. And frankly, a lot of them still are, but so shocking and I guess groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah.
And kind of looking back with this, this 21st century perspective on everything. Crazy. Like, how did you guys get together to start making this particular documentary all about Jerry Springer and crazy American television?
Well, I mean, basically, obviously we both work at Minnow Films. I just directed a film for Minnow. Me and Sophie have both worked on that together. I had a period of ill health, so I've been away. I've been working in development, but then I'd sort of been away, and I came back, and we were sort of going through what was on the Minnow development slate, and I saw, or so I can't remember if I saw it or someone said, I think probably someone said, we're talking to Netflix about the Jerry Springer show, and I was like, yes, because I was kind of looking for my next project to direct, and I was like, yes, that's the one. I really would love to do that. I mean, like you, I've watched it, I don't know how old you are, Brian, but around the time it sort of came to Britain and became big, I guess I was sort of maybe 16, 17, really, when I sort of started to become aware of it. And it was like TV from another planet, the planet being called America. And I was like, wow, God, this is crazy. How are these, why is this happening? How are they getting away with this? How are they putting on TV? How are they getting people to act like that on stage? And it was like nothing else I'd ever seen. And so when the opportunity came up, I was like, yes, I'd love to revisit that, from the lens, looking at it back at it now. It felt kind of different to the stuff that I'd been doing before. So it was like I jumped at the chance, really.
How about you, Sophie? What'd you think when you were approached with this, or how did you get involved with this craziness?
So basically, I was on maternity leave when this was greenlit, and when I came back, I kind of jumped back. I jumped on it with Luke and the team, and it. Do you know what? It felt like the right time to be looking at it, to be honest with you, in terms of the length of time that's gone past and all that thing. It felt like an absolute ripe time to look back in it. I used to watch it, just like Luke said, I used to watch it with my granny on a Saturday afternoon, and they used to play it over here on, I think it was ITV or ITV2 on a Saturday afternoon. And now you look back on it, and you realise how violent it was, how shocking it was. And at the time, it completely washed over you, and it was great television and we were all completely indulgent in it. But my granny loved it, as did I.
I know, like it was something like even my mom and I, she was quite a bit older than my friends' moms. She was 40 when I was born. But so like when I was in, early 20s, she's in her 60s. And she's like, I can't believe what I saw on Jerry Springer. And she would talk about the fist fights and the craziness and the depraved sex triangles and all these kinds of things. And it was a weird way for us to kind of bond and whatnot, but it was must-see television in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Here's a funny thing. I was kind of a jokester. And when I was living with two friends in college, I actually called, we'd watch Jerry Springer because it was on during the day and it was funny as hell. But I called the hotline one time and I made up a fake situation. It was like, do you have a weird sex triangle or some kind of thing that you'd like to tell So I called and I left a message and I thought nothing of it. And then a couple days later, and it must have been, I'm looking over my notes here. It must have been perhaps Toby Yoshimura, because a gentleman called me back and left a message on our answering machine at the house saying that he would like to talk to me about this situation. And I never called him back because I chickened out. And it was a gentleman.
Oh, wow.
Wow, amazing.
That's amazing.
I know. My wife is like, I can't believe you called that one time. And because I made up something I said something like, well, I was in the hot tub and my stepdad, it was totally weird. You know what I mean? Made a pass at me. But then there was I went on, it was a total prank. So I can't remember the particulars. It was really depraved that my 20-year-old mind came up with. But yeah, I got a call back from the Springer Show wanting to talk further about it, but I totally chickened out.
You really went there with a Jerry line. You really went there for the Jerry storyline.
Right.
That's amazing. Gosh.
There's a hot tub. There's a stepdad.
Yeah. I knew the material well.
I mean, they were obviously crying out for content. I mean, they had to make over 200 shows a year. I can't remember the exact figure, maybe 260 or something like that. So, getting the folk for it, it was a big kind of operation. And I think, there were a lot of folk like yourself phoning in with, kind of made up stories and craziness. And, and I think, it was such a, when would that have been? Would that have been in its utter heyday when it was sort of biggest show in the world kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm talking I lived in that house 98 and 99.
Yeah.
Peak time.
Yeah, I mean, that was the big moment where it was breaking out as this, cultural, phenomenon. And over here, it was just, it was so, they pushed the envelope and the boundaries in terms of what could go on TV in a way that had never been done before, and just really went for it, and obviously in the doc, that's a big part of the story we tell, the story of the rise of the show, and the sort of key role that Richard Dominic, the exec producer, played in it, and how he, in many ways was this kind of visionary figure that kind of just had this amazing ability to know what people wanted to watch, which is a talent,
For sure.
And also that thing of once they kind of got to the top and they beat Oprah, which no other show had ever done in the world, it's that thing of how do you stay on top? You have to keep pushing that needle and you have to keep pushing those boundaries in order to keep those figures coming in, because that ultimately is the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the show opens up. Well, first of all, you have an open with the famous I Married a Horse episode just to kind of
Yes. It could be no other show to open it.
Right. You have to open the show in a way that reminds people right away what we're going to be talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it is the most notorious episode of the Springer Show, in history. And, you don't have to sort of Google it and look through various articles. I mean, it's always on the list. And I mean, Richard himself says in the doc, it was the perfect show, so of all the shows, it kind of had to be that, really. And also it's kind of nice because when it went out, it was around the time when they, became the biggest show in the world. So you could kind of nicely sort of bookend, episode one with that episode. So it kind of worked nicely just in terms of the sort of way in which we're sort of, telling the story. But yeah, I mean, unbelievable. And a lot of people didn't see it. I mean, it went out later, I think, on their, on their VHS, Too Hot for TV stuff. But obviously, it was banned, because, people didn't want to see that. Or were shocked by it because it was just like, insane stuff. And I've seen the whole show. I mean, naturally, we only focus on a little bit of it, but the other stories after it are quite something as well. So yeah, we talked for quite a while about how much, and tonally, one of the things that's difficult with the show, and obviously looking at it, or that was challenging with the series, because obviously looking at it now, through the lens, looking back on it, is just tonally, how you revisit this in a way that feels kind of fair in terms of reflecting maybe how we all came to the show as the audience, but also then, kind of, obviously later the doc sort of gets much more into the sort of lines of the kind of world of, where are the boundaries, what should be on TV, what shouldn't, how far were they exploiting people, and this kind of tragedy, ultimately, the tragedy with Nancy Campbell that was caught up with the show. So tonally, it was a kind of challenge in terms of, riding that really in terms of the series. Mm-hmm. But one, hopefully that, we sort of succeeded, at or with.
And so that's that thing as well. So much time has passed, you've got 20, 25 years. And I do think, me and Luke often talk about this. It's that thing of, I actually don't think this doc series could have been made kind of 5-10 years ago. I genuinely believe it's needed that passage of time for people to reflect, be able to have that distance from it. And that's why I think they speak with such, raw honesty. They're so candid about the tactics, what they did, how, the inner workings of the show and all of that. And I think they've kind of needed that time to be able to reflect, to come back to it and be able to talk about it in the way they do. Yeah, no, 100%. It's kind of interesting as well because it's like, obviously, there were people like you phoning in, there were obviously fake stories, to what extent, but there were also real people caught up in this, and the thing with the show is that it and with the generosity of the interviews with our sort of producer characters who are very open and very like reflective on their experience of the show, they went on a real journey as well and started questioning, how far that they were sort of pushing things. Particularly, you mentioned Toby, he goes on a real journey in the series.
Now, let me ask you about this, because you had to go through, I guess, not decades, but years and years and years of episodes. Now, you start showing Jerry at his very humble beginnings, kind of the milquetoast, very politically bent show, very serious. And then by all accounts, by all estimates, there's I've read there's between 3,891 to 4,969 episodes. I'm sure there's amalgamations and best ofs and things like that makes the number fluctuate. But like 4,000 episodes roughly that you guys have to think about and go through. That's a lot of content and what to include and what not to include. So like when you're putting together an hour and a half long documentary, 2 parts, about 45 minutes each, like how do you decide how to tell a story with that much content?
It's kind of, I guess on the face of it, it's sort of intimidating because, you've got this series that ran for 27 years. And yeah, there's a lot of shows. I think ultimately, we didn't want to necessarily do. It needed to, have real narrative sort of propulsion and kind of focus, and we didn't want to do just a sort of generic history of the Jerry Springer Show. We wanted to focus it through a kind of key story that would, tie it all together, I guess. And I think that the access that we had, because obviously the other issue is that, with a series that runs for 27 years, you've got people who were there at different kind of times. So ultimately the access that we got and the people who we got were there roughly around the same time, pretty much all the same kind of time, So we were able to then focus it on the heyday, the 90s, 92 really until sort of the early noughties. And also it felt like in many ways that time period reflected the story of the show. It kind of all happened. And then probably there was a very slow decline, that happened over, say, 16 years. That's sort of harder to sort of deal with in terms of, narrative. So that really, I guess, helped us formulate how we would tell the story, how we would sort of structure it, what to focus on. And I was quite keen as well that, it needed to be in that time. So all the archive and all the shows that we focused on were predominantly in that period where you had the kind of classic brick set, so we don't go too far. So sort of after that, I think they changed the set around 2000, which is just slightly after the Nancy Campbell murder happened. But in a way, that's the kind of end of the story that we were sort of focusing on, and the journeys that the producers have been on had sort of unfolded through that. And it felt like that was a good way to kind of focus it. So we didn't have to necessarily watch every single episode. It was more like a sort of research period, talking to people and then working out what we were going to focus on and then pulling the episodes that might relate to that. And also episodes that people could talk about that they were involved in as well. Because of the way we were doing it, we were, a lot of the archive came from like YouTube and various different sources. So it was also like what was out there, what could we get and find and pull together really.
Yeah, no, exactly that. The other thing I think was important as well was around Richard as well, in terms of the kind of timeline. It kind of starts with Richard and it kind of ends with Richard when Richard leaves the show. And it does feel like that was, as Luke said, the heyday really of the Springer Show. And, that's certainly when it reached its peak. It beat Oprah. It did all those key things within the kind of Springer journey that we wanted to tell.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because in a way, it's, he's the guy that is responsible for the show that we all know it to be. So, yeah, when he goes, when Toby goes, our story's over. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. What I like about it is like, not only do you get some insight on Jerry Springer, but also the key figures that were the behind the scenes, the workhorses of the show for sure. Like you just mentioned, Richard Dominic, the longtime producer of the show. And it was neat to see like Richard Younger appearing on the David Letterman show, like all that kind of archive footage of like why he was brought in to kind of bring in this milquetoast show with sagging ratings, to kind of infuse some energy into it, and energy indeed. I mean, there was a quote I read that was attributed to him that if you're interested in saving the whales, you call Oprah. If you're interested in dating a horse, you call us. And so that was his mindset. And there's some chilling quotes from Richard in your documentary about like if he could film somebody getting killed, he would put it on the show. And it was like, yikes. I mean, anything for ratings for sure. Then we mentioned Toby Yashimura and his dad, the longtime, one of the longtime producers, directors or producers on Saturday Night Live. So it comes from this this TV heritage. And his dad did not like him being on Jerry Springer Show.
No.
The producer, Melinda Chait Meal, I think is how you pronounce her name. All the stories that she brought to the table. Like I really enjoyed you guys digging in and talking to the producers, the ones that really responsible for giving us this unique, crazy vision of America that is the focus of this documentary.
Yeah, I mean, and they were all very amazing and very generous with their time and their kind of insights and their ability to kind of reflect on it, and just like amazing characters, on screen to kind of have. And yeah, I mean, I can't thank them enough for sort of getting on board, really. And And, Melinda and Toby, they're very proud of like the horse episode. I mean, they were both involved in that, but Melinda was the producer and Toby was the associate producer. You can kind of see why, because it is extraordinary, extraordinary kind of, television. But I think ultimately, they were all working under the sort of, instruction of Richard, who, was this incredibly visionary, sort of no hold barred kind of guy who didn't really see any kind of limits as to what you could put on TV. I do think there is an element of him where he did, there's the interview where you mentioned it, where he talks about, if I could kill someone on TV. I never quite, what was interesting about Richard, when I was sort of interviewing him, you never quite knew to what extent he was playing this role, playing out to this sort of pantomime villain kind of role, or to what extent he believed it. And I felt like in that interview, there's a twinkle in his eye where he's just almost saying that for shock. But then and we didn't put this in, but I did interview him and I asked him at the very end of our time with him, I asked him about that quote and I just said, look, if someone, would you answer that question differently now? Kind of half expecting he would. He was like, so giving it some thought, I would still say the same thing. So, he's got incredibly broad shoulders and I guess you'd have to do that and to be so ballsy to put that stuff on TV and drive it through, with opposition from his bosses or whatever. And, he's pretty unapologetic about it, and I mean, that takes something.
But as you said, Luke, he was a visionary. There's no way around that. In terms of, he came with a game plan. Jerry was an unknown. So that's why they got the Jerry chant, Jerry, Jerry. They wanted that because he was unknown. Nobody knew who Jerry was. So they thought, let's start chanting his name. Everyone will think he's famous and know who he is. They wanted the way they shot the show. They wanted low camera things like it was a football game. All of those things, that was really visionary. And it probably pushed the needle forward. Also, the reality is, I think it was probably the very, very origins of reality TV, from where we are now to where, that felt like the first time that you were watching something that made you go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm allowed to watch this, and that was him, he was the start of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, kind of amazing, really. And those clips on the Letterman, I remember I found them on YouTube. I don't know why, but I just thought I'd Google him and it just came up and I was like, bloody hell, this is, this is amazing. And, that was his whole thing. He brought that kind of tabloid sensibility, those kind of crazy stories into the Springer show. And, it was a simple idea, needs to be interesting with the sound off. It needs to be outrageous. It needs to be sexy. And that was very much how it sort of started. He talked about it in the doc originally. It was like, let's make it sexy. And it's interesting, like it came on after, because it had got relegated in the schedules because it was doing so badly. It was on after like the Letterman show and stuff. So he was like, let's change this. So we're getting the audience, like the Letterman crowd, the college kids. And of course that was the big, like you watching it back in the 90s, they were the key demographic that they were going for. And it really worked.
Absolutely. Netflix documentaries, especially, I've noticed, they have this great, all great documentaries, but I'm really happy to find this on Netflix documentaries just because of the wide variety that they offer. But really great documentaries have a real element that you can really sense the humanity of the subjects that you're talking to. And I credit you guys as filmmakers for doing this too, because there are times when you can feel the pain in Toby's voice, Toby Yoshimura's voice. You can also feel the kind of the consternation on his face. You can read the turmoil of like reliving those years. Cause he even says at the beginning, like, this is the last time I'm going to talk about that fucking show. Like he says that at the beginning of the documentary.
Do you know what? I really believe him. I really, really believe him.
Yeah. So like that human element of like, yeah, they did groundbreaking TV. Yeah, they did it for a sustained long amount of time. Yeah, they beat Oprah, but like, boy, that was just an internal combustion engine running on all cylinders all the time. I mean, he slept in his office, so he talks. I'm not giving too much away, but that's that real human element of just not just producing a hit TV show, but the turmoil of putting together a hit TV show. it was really very fascinating to watch, to see that side, that dark side of reality or television like that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it was a real pressure cooker. And I think, that's what I mean about having contributors that can really go there and reflect. And I think, I really admired that about Toby. He really goes there and he's really open and honest about it. And, I think there's a level to which, you could really simplify this story as like TV producers bad. I think Toby just showed, he's a, they're people. People are kind of the grey areas. It's sort of, they were under pressure. They were struggling with stuff. They were burnt out. And I think that's why he was such a key kind of element to the series. And, sort of just spoke so openly. It was a kind of joy, really.
And as time goes on, it's that thing of, the story that broke him, the incest story, when he kind of goes, that's it. I've had enough now. You can really, for me anyway, I really felt his time on the show and the burden of the stories and the pressure. You've got the burden of stories on one shoulder and the kind of pressure of the show on the other. And I think probably through the passage of time, he's able to reflect on that quite eloquently now. And you really do go on that journey with him to kind of understand what it was like to be in his shoes, really.
Yeah, gosh, I was just making notes here, thinking about the variety of episodes and like how to wrap your brain around them. Like you just mentioned the incestuous show that kind of gave Toby pause. We earlier mentioned bestiality. Then there was the famous episode called Clanfrontation, when they had people from the Ku Klux Klan come in with all their BS, and which really started like the episodic fistfights on stage. Just like how much. You say groundbreaking, but it's like earth-shattering is probably a better word than saying just groundbreaking approach to, talking about these topics, in a gross, funny sometimes, but always compelling way.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, nothing seemed off limits, really. It's extraordinary. And actually going back and, you were talking earlier about, how did you begin to deal with 3,000 plus episodes? One of the things that struck me when I first started looking at the material again is just how shocking it is now to sort of see it. You're like, at the time it felt shocking, but then to revisit it after sort of 20 years, you're like, oh my God, this is super crazy what they were doing. And in many ways, just incredibly cynical. They didn't really care about anything else than just the eyeballs and getting the ratings and just making the most salacious, explosive TV possible. They were very sort of, and they were kind of open, about that. I mean, but I think both Richard and, Annette at points, like, we weren't there to help anyone, and they weren't at all. They just, you needed to go out there, tell your story, perform. And that's kind of what it was all about, really. Yeah.
And they talk about, I think it's Toby, isn't it, that says that thing about getting springered, the tactics they use in order to get people on and get people off, and, how to keep people on the stage to perform and make sure they deliver the show they want and all those things. And I think it's one of those things, I think, when you're in that bubble, you're very much probably doing a job from A to Z. You just get through. You just need those people to deliver for you, and that's it. And that's probably where the show starts to dismantle, is the fact of it's not just about that. It's not just about them telling that part of the story and getting them to perform. It's everything else that goes around that probably they're failing at, in terms of like duty of care to them and all of those things. The fact that most of these individuals were vulnerable, that, they were coming to look for answers that they were probably never going to find on the Jerry Springer show.
Yeah. I mean, Melinda talks about, obviously there were people that phoned up and were just having a laugh, but, Melinda in the doc is like, number of people that phoned me saying, I can't wait for Jerry to help me, sort this out. And actually that's one thing to, talking about the bestiality, clanfrontation, all the kind of different kind of crazy shows and the sort of fact that, nothing seemed too extreme for the show. It's important to state the, and obviously that was very much Richard's kind of vision for it. But we mustn't forget Jerry, in terms of how key he was at making that show so successful. And it always sort of felt like, there's Jerry Springer and then there's a Jerry Springer show. And in a weird way, your feelings can be different for both of them, and he had this sort of almost Teflon sort of way of being able to deflect criticism. And a lot of people saw him as very much a good bloke. And the producers talk very highly of him in the show and are quite protective of him. And he was key, I think, in bringing the audience into this world and making it somehow palatable. He had this very avuncular manner, and that was a kind of genius thing, really, to pair him with this outrageous content.
He was the guy that gave permission. He gave you permission to watch it, and it was okay to watch it. You've got this very lovely middle-class guy that's a bit like your uncle or your dad. And, he's looking at it in wonder and ponder and all of those things, the way he looks on these things. And he always gives his lovely, ending speech, doesn't he? Take care of yourselves and each other. And he's the one that kind of holds your hand through watching the fighting, the swearing, the violence, everything else that goes with that. And he kind of goes, it's okay, guys, I've got you. You can watch it. And you're right, Luke, he's so key in allowing us to all enjoy it as well.
Yeah, he had a low-key charisma, kind of a self-depreciating style, because he talked about, he was the first one to admit that his show was kind of crazy, He was the first one, and he's not sitting there like whipping the crowd into a frenzy himself. He had his handlers, he had his security, he had his other staff doing that for him. But I mean, he just kind of sat back and just let chaos reign, and he just kind of pulled the reins in at the end for every episode with his guests. I got some questions about the guests. Now, you had some that you talked to on this documentary, some former guests, but it was really, really cool to see on your doc the behind the scenes stuff. Like there was some scenes of guests getting coached. There's always a question of whether or not the guests were real. And some, there's some talk about there was an instance or two of some fakery, but like there was more of these guests being coached and being encouraged to do things. And so it was really neat to see how that part of the show came about. Also, like the recruitment of guests, I guess you could say, and also how they were treated. Like it talks about how they come to Chicago for the first time, and many of them never seen deep dish pizza. They've never seen the big city before. They never saw these things, and so they were just kind of like starstruck.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, and that was quite. When we sort of heard that, from the producers and the folk in the doc, it was quite shocking to see how coordinated the tactics were and how clearly sort of thought through it was, and jaw dropping, really. And they talk about a lot of the guests coming from the Springer Triangle, a very specific sort of part of America, which I also found sort of quite extraordinary. And also, Melinda's story about how she got fired because of the fake guests. They found out that they were fake guests that had come on the show, and she had her spidey sense was tingling because they were from Boston and Springer guests aren't from Boston. All this kind of stuff. I mean, I found that sort of really interesting because that is coming from the UK. That's the stuff I guess we don't really sort of kind of know about. But no, they were clearly very good at getting the performance, and coaching to what extent that was, or just guaranteeing that whatever the story was, it was going to unfold on screen, and how they I mean, it's highly manipulative, and they clearly struggled with it as well, ultimately, but the degree to which they were doing that, I was quite shocked by.
Yeah, and how open they were about what they were doing as well.
Yeah.
What I think Toby, isn't it, says, revving them up to 100 and chucking them on stage, all of that coaching behind stage, which we see in the archive. I genuinely think that would be incredibly shocking for people to see that went on. That's before they even set foot on stage and all the drama unfolds. They've been coached, they've been screamed at, they've been well prepared for it, I suppose. So they're ready to go out and fight, whether that be physically or verbally, they're ready for it.
I certainly have listeners in the Springer Triangle of Tennessee, Ohio, and Georgia. But what's interesting to me also is like, putting myself back into that time period, there was no social media. There was no TikTok. There was no, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any kind of online, like real recruitment of these guests. It's you watch the show and then you call an 800 number, and that's how they worked it. They worked the phones. And so people saw the long form version of these shows, not little, social media snips or clips, and to recruit guests that way, like with old school, call the show, leave a message. And then the producers on the other end, yeah, I think we can use this person. I think we can use this person. Boom, there's an episode. We'll call him, we'll fly him in, we'll get him on the show. It's just to see how they did this for, like you said, 200 episodes a year. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of work. That's a lot.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a massive operation, and obviously as well, as the show became more popular, more people would call in.
Right.
So I think there became a point where they didn't have to. I think maybe in the beginning they were much more like, how are we going to find these people? And I think they would chase the news stories a bit more as well. And as the show started to become more popular, they wouldn't chase the news stories. It was just all about those phone lines, and they would just be inundated. And obviously, one of the big ones we go into there is the horse. The story of Toby. Which I think is an amazing moment, because I think working in TV, probably all people that work in TV can kind of appreciate the magnitude of getting a phone call and a guy saying, "I've left my wife and children to marry my horse. I'd like to be on your TV show," and the sense of, wow, that's a story. I think probably quite a lot of us can kind of sort of, relate to that in some way.
Our modern day version of that is when the producer said yes to taking part in our documentary.
Yes, exactly. No,
we're like, yes, we've got them. This is great. They're going to talk.
Well, you guys have all this great archive footage, but then I also saw, I watched the doc twice. Like my wife and I watched it when I was able to get the preview, and I just binged it. I'm like, oh yeah. I was figuring like, I'll watch one part now and one part later, but I was like, nah, just go right through it. It was so good. But then when I watched it again with more of an eye on in terms of what we're going to talk about on this episode, I saw at the end that there was you had cast on there. So I thought, as I want to credit you as filmmakers, like taking archive footage and behind the scenes footage and these interviews that you did on camera. But then there was also, were there some recreations on there too? I didn't even catch it the first time through that there was a little bit of recreation there.
Oh, that's great. That's really good. That's good. That's good to know. Yeah, no, definitely. No, there were some sort of slight, sort of visualizations. So, I think there were some behind the scenes shots. I think it's very clear when it's archived, and then because the way we sort of shot the doc was super stylized and sort of theatrical, and the whole idea was that we would try and make, I don't know if this comes across really, but it would try and make the interview setups and any kind of B-roll feel like you were in the studio, the Springer studio, while the show, was being kind of recorded, in the background, just kind of place people there back in the moment. And yeah, we did some recreations of sort of Toby and Richard in his office, and then a little bit of Jerry, but not a huge amount. I mean, because there's so much amazing archive, and it's very hard to sort of compete with the archive really in that sense,
Did you guys reach out to Oprah for any comment?
See, that's a good point. No, we didn't. We sort of struggled to find. It was quite late when we managed to find a bit of her in the archive. There's a lot of sort of press written stuff about it, but it was a real battle to find something of her sort of saying her piece about it. And yeah, quite late in the day, our amazing archive producer found that, and it was like, yes, this is kind of amazing, and she's very strong. Small little presence, but very strong, and important to kind of be in there.
Jerry plays his part very well in that kind of the Oprah Jerry battle. He's a very cool customer, a PR savvy man, and plays his cards well.
Yeah, I don't know how to read Jerry in that. I'm sure he was like, wow, we just beat Oprah, and that's always the intent, to be as successful as you want. But I wonder if it also was like, wow, like our show beat the Oprah win.
I think that is definitely how they felt about it. I think they were all, there's no way around that. I think they were all utterly surprised and flabbergasted that they'd managed to beat Oprah.
Amazing. I'm always careful when I have creative people on the show not to give too much away. I want people to go out and watch this and relive the early 2000s and all its glory, all its American television glory. But I do want to touch a little bit about, there's a prominent part of your doc about the episode that came out in the year 2000, Secret Mistress Confronted, and the murder that happened pretty much immediately after the airing of a taped episode of some guests, a terrible love triangle gone bad. But what I want to talk about is like your interview with the son, Jeffrey, and talking about his mom. Like that must have been really, really hard for you guys because there's so much hilarity and so much the madcap hijinks of the Jerry Springer show. But then you're talking to his son about his mom who got murdered, by her abusive husband, and they appeared on the show and there was a love triangle and just all of that. Like I thought, like for you guys to be able to handle that importantly or with the respect it deserved in the middle of this circus, I thought was well done too.
Well, that's really good to hear because, that was a really important story for us to tell. We wanted to give Nancy a voice, and I sort of mentioned earlier about the tonal challenges of it, and that certainly was, a big challenge. How do you knit that together in that kind of way? And I think that's where the sort of 2 episode structure sort of really helped us, in terms of that. Jeffrey, amazingly, have absolute admiration for Jeffrey, amazingly brave, in telling his mum's story and telling his story. I guess that was a long process of sort of, building trust. Our producer, Catherine Manan, was incredible in terms of how she sort of, managed that and is still managing that situation. And just, it was a real privilege to be able to talk to him. I'll be forever grateful for it because I think it's a really important thing to say and to include, because ultimately that's the sort of story we're telling. Ultimately it's about like, where's the line and is this stuff good? Duty of care, all those kind of things. So we had to sort of go there with it, because once they'd unleashed this sort of, once they'd opened the Pandora's box, this is the kind of territory that you can potentially get into, really.
And I think more than anything, I think Jeffrey was really keen to talk about his mum and, bring his mum alive and talk about her experience. And, he talks about it very openly on in the doc, where he talks about what an effect it's had on his life, which is hugely profound. And I agree with Luke. We couldn't be more thankful to him for being as honest and generous with us as he was. And I think it was an incredibly difficult thing for him to do. But ultimately, I hope he's proud of it, and I hope he's proud of his contribution and what he was able to bring to the conversation around it.
Yeah, massively important voice. And we took the interview slowly and very much sort of did things at his pace, and just made sure that he felt comfortable and kind of looked after, because it's always really difficult to sort of talk to people about really tough things that they've sort of been through. So yeah.
I'm just curious, just from the creative standpoint of it. So a documentary gets thought of, it gets proposed, it gets pitched, it gets greenlit. Like when you guys get greenlit and you're going forward with Minnow Films, how long does it take for it to be finished? And like what's the creative process of that like? Are there like a lot of do you have to have like a master cut delivered at a certain date, or do you have dailies like other films? So, I'm just curious about that, just from just a purely creative behind the scenes question.
Okay, so basically from point of from kind of point of coming up with the idea to pitching in the idea and starting that process of a seedling, I'd say from there to green light is between kind of 6 and 12 months. That's not a short, by the time it goes into a development process and all of that stuff. For Jerry, I was actually on maternity leave when Jerry was greenlit. Do you remember, Luke, how long it was specifically? I think it's about 6-8 months.
So I think development, when I first heard about it, would have been, let me get the years right, November 2022. And so we'd originally approached Jerry's people. And Jerry was alive when we started the whole process. And he didn't want to be involved in the doc ultimately. That decision coincided with, I think, his illness. He then died April 2023. And I remember I was sort of putting together what's called a sizzle, like a sort of, some of the archive and stuff, just to sort of sell the doc. And he, the news came through that he passed. I think it was June 2023 that the doc was greenlit, and then we went into production shortly after that. We were filming in Chicago this time last year, and we finished October. So, I mean, all in all, it's probably the production of this was around probably a year and a half, I guess.
Yeah.
But it can vary. This was the sort of, there were some other aspects of this that sort of were harder to sort of get. So we had to kind of wait for things. But yeah, they're a big kind of commitment. They take a while.
I was just curious, just out of my own personal curiosity. I've filmed a couple things, and my listeners know about this. But just like when you go and film something, and then you talk to producers, and then it's months kind of go by, and then they're like, oh, hey, it's coming out, and you're like, oh wow, not that I forgot about it, but it's like you just kind of lose track. But there's always these things behind the scenes, and I just wonder, it's very interesting to me how creative people go about their creation of content. So I thank you for the insight in that. So when this is all said and done and it's out there in the world, as this episode comes out, it's been out for about a week. So I didn't want to give away too much. I want people to go see it, but I also don't want to spoil it for people that haven't. What are your final thoughts? Like Jerry always had his final thoughts. Like, what are your final thoughts on that era of crazy American television?
You go first, Luke.
Okay. I mean, look, ultimately, the reason we made the doc is because, it wasn't just any TV show. It was the TV show that pushed the boundary more than anything else. It was seminal. It kind of changed TV landscape in many ways, ushered in reality TV. It was a big kind of deal. I think, interestingly, the story that we tell ultimately, I think, TV has moved on now, I think, in Britain. I mean, I know that, Springer is very much a kind of an American phenomenon, but, it does feel like things are better than it was sort of back then. And I think, for me, I guess, the story is a cautionary one, it's a cautionary tale. And I guess, Jerry at the end would always say, take care of yourself and each other. And I kind of think that was something that they lost sight of or weren't really interested in the first place. And I think, I'd like that to be the kind of takeaway that actually, particularly in the world that we're living in now, quite a world of division, that actually, we should be more like, we should be taking care of ourselves and each other more. Ultimately, I'd say that would be the big thing. And also, I think Toby's line at the end of the doc where he kind of, there's a line at the end of the documentary where Toby breaks the fourth wall and sort of challenges us as filmmakers and the audience about, who's the problem here? And I think ultimately anyone who's indulged in that show is culpable in some way for that show. And I think that's an important thing to kind of, to sort of realize.
You're totally right. My kind of sum up is very similar to Luke's. I think it is really important to, that thing, it is a cautionary tale. And I think it's a cautionary tale actually from both ends. Like, I look at Jerry and I look at his legacy and I do question whether he's happy with that legacy, that thing of, he signed, for me personally, when I look back at his story, I kind of think he kind of signed a deal with the devil slightly. You know, he was a politico. You know, he was an incredibly smart, charismatic man that, you know, was mayor of Cincinnati for a period of time. And he could have had a very, you know, big, ambitious political career potentially at the White House. Though actually, maybe that was a double-edged sword in a different way. But, you know, I do think, you know, it's a slightly separate thing for him. Where he's ended up ultimately, is this something he's proud of? Is this something that he is glad that he dedicated his life to, you know, the last years of his life? And I think that potentially that's quite a sad way to end things when you look back at your legacy. But ultimately, you're right. As Luke said, that thing when he says, you know, take care of yourself and each other, I think that's what we all need to hold on to as program makers and certainly documentary makers. You know, we need to take care of everyone. We need to really understand and respect and ensure that our contributors are well looked after through this process. It can be a grueling process sometimes. And when they give you their trust and they say, okay, I'm prepared to come and talk to you and give you my story, we need to handle that with care and with respect. And, you know, we honor that now. And I think we're very much in a different landscape now in 2024, now 2025, looking back on that. And that I think we can all be proud of and be glad that we're in a different space for it.
Oh, absolutely. Very well put, you two. I just want to congratulate you on this documentary. I know it was a labor of love and you worked very hard on it, and it shows as each minute passes by. And for you to take this time out of your busy schedule, I know the time zones and everything is sometimes it's goofy to coordinate these kind of talks and everything. But I really appreciate you guys taking the time, because I really love talking to creative people that you know, are very thoughtful in their work. And you're taking something that is the modern version of the Roman Colosseum in many ways, and making a thoughtful, thought-provoking, funny as hell documentary too. Let's not forget that. I mean, there's a lot of laughs in this documentary too, but it's just a great sit down and watch. 2 episodes long. Jerry Springer fights camera action on Netflix right now. Sophie Jones, Luke Sewell, I can't thank you enough for being guests on my show. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, there we go, everybody. Episode 290. Fights, camera, action. All about the Jerry Springer Show. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I had having it with my new friends, Sophie and Luke and Sarah over at Netflix. What's up, Sarah? All right, my friends. 291. I'm super excited to bring you a conversation with New York Times bestselling author. I really hit it off with him. J.D. Barker and his incredible new book, We Don't Talk About Emma. Well, we're going to talk about We Don't Talk About Emma. That's episode 291 on Necronomicast. That's coming out February 1st. And then after that, hold on to your hats. We've got an announcement about Historic Haunted Heartland Part 4 happening in October. A bunch of announcements, news, guests, fun, shenanigans. So in the meantime, as you wait for that next episode to drop, head on over to YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Like it. If you would, leave a nice tasty review or a 5 stars over at iTunes or Spotify. Much appreciated. Had a little scare the other day. I had 666 subscribers to YouTube. Thank God I'm up to more than that now. It was looking a little hairy for a while. So until then, everybody, thank you for listening. Have a good night. Have a good life. Now go get some sleep.